Hello everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a 2000 rated over-the-board chess player, and in this series we are climbing to 2000 ELO using only the King's Indian defense, and I'll be explaining my thought process as best as I can for your education and entertainment. So, against d4, we have to start with d6, because if we go for the normal King's Indian setup with knight f6, g6, bishop g7, then we will be hit with e5, and we will not be playing in King's Indian. We'll be playing oh my god, I forgot the name of the opening. The Alekhines defense. Sorry. So, d6, which is technically the perk, or the pits. But my opponent can go, like, for example, if my opponent goes d4, I don't know, like knight f6, bishop d3, and looks to play c4, then we'll have a normal King's Indian. But we'll see what he goes for. Knight f6. Now, in this position, the point of the pawn on d6 is to stop pawn to e5. In theory, white can still play the move e5, because it's protected by the d-pawn, but it's a very bad move, because after pawn e5, take, queen takes d1, king takes d1, and knight to g4, we would be threatening a fork on f2 and threatening the e5 pawn, and we'd just be winning. So my opponent goes f3, guarding the e4 pawn, which apparently is a move. It's called the Lion's Jaw variation, which is an awesome name, I have to say. But we're just going to continue with the plan. Now, you may be saying, oh, well, now you can go e5 as white, because after take, there's no knight to g4. And you wouldn't be wrong, but the e5 pawn would still be a massive weakness, and the king wouldn't be able to castle. There's not really a need for white to do that. So we'll continue developing, and I think this is now a proper King's Indian defense, the same-ish variation. So we have the pawns on e4, d4, and c4. The pawn on f3 guarding e4 and preparing a future g4 move. This is one of the most aggressive lines that white can go for. Now, I think we can go ahead and castle here, and then I'm not sure whether we should be looking for c5 or e5, because we want to play one of them. That's kind of the bog standard way to do the King's Indian, is to play either e5 or c5. Bishop to e3 is intended to play queen d2 and go for bishop h6. And it also justifies the move f3 very nicely, because typically, if this pawn is back on f2 and the knight is on f3, then we can go knight g4 chasing the bishop. Because we would happily take the bishop and have an uncontested dark-squared bishop. So pawn f3 stops the knight from coming to g4, and it's just a good move overall. So I think e5 makes sense. e5, d5, and maybe we can go knight d7 and look to play f5. I think. If e5 take, then we're doing absolutely fine. If e5 and queen d2, knight c6, pawn d5, knight e7, bishop h6. How do we proceed there? Maybe c6. Maybe c6 makes sense. I suppose losing the dark squared bishop isn't the end of the world. We should consider what happens if we do go pawn c5. But the problem is, after white takes, if we take, we're going to lose a pawn, right? So c5 take, we have to do something else. We could try queen to a5, which is a very common way to gang up on the knight on c3, but my knight can't come into e4 because it's protected by the f-pawn, so that doesn't really seem to do anything useful. So instead, I think e5 is probably the way to go. Again, like I said, in the King's Indian, normally you're either going to go e5 or c5, and depending on the situation on the board, it could be either. But you kind of need to go for one of them. And okay, so clearly, if this pawn could hop over this knight, we would immediately go pawn to f5. That's kind of the whole point of the King's Indian in lots of the lines. But of course, we can't do that. Now, we could try to prepare the move with a move like knight to h4, which to me looks quite interesting, looking for queen h4 check. Although I suppose it's bishop f2. I was going to say if g3, we have knight g3, because if take, then take. But there is bishop f2. But I think we can also put the knight on f4, because if white initiates this trade, then we open up our dark squared bishop. If h5, g4, well, we can give a check on h4, but bishop f2. So I think we just go for knight to f4, and we should be fine. If something like knight h5 and queen d2, preparing bishop h6, I assume we go pawn f5 immediately. We could start with knight d7, but I think I like knight to h5 personally. I'm not entirely sure if this is the quote-unquote correct line to go for, but it seems to me to be thematic. And as I said, I'm not really concerned about this knight getting kicked with a move like g4, because while in one sense it accelerates White's kingside attack because he gets to push the g-pawn with tempo, we kind of want to go f5 anyway. And also, if our knight gets to f4, it will be quite a strong piece, I think. I mean, I suppose if our knight gets to f4, White could just put a knight on e2 and offer us a trade. So something like g4, knight f4, knight e2, offering us a knight trade. He could go for that. That's an interesting idea. Do we go f5 anyway? That feels very risky. Okay, he starts with knight g to e2, which makes a lot of sense. And I think we just have to go f5 immediately. Now, one thing to consider is if f5, ef5, bishop f5, that is pawn g4, forking our minor pieces. So if f5 take, we could consider rook takes, with the idea of meeting g4 with rook f3 hitting the bishop. That's interesting. For f5 take, it's actually an interesting move. Queen h4 check. And after bishop f2, we can take on c4. I'm not sure if it does anything useful, but it's an interesting concept. I'm not really sure what else we do here. I mean, we can go knight to a6. Doesn't really do anything. c6 is often a move, but in this position, I'm not so sure. So I think we should go f5. Now, if we get the opportunity, then I assume we go pawn to f4, hitting the bishop, and preparing a kingside attack ourselves with something like g5, g4. Probably. We'll have to see. But I think the critical move would be probably for White to take on f5, and we'll have to figure out the plan. So takes... I've got to say, queen h4 does look like a very interesting move, going after the c4 pawn, because it kind of does completely undermine the d5 pawn, because we force the e pawn away from the defense, and we take the c4 pawn, which leaves d5 isolated. It's not that easy to attack, but it's interesting. Okay, ef5. As I said, if bishop f5, pawn g4, we don't have anything. Queen h4 is met with bishop to f2. So that doesn't seem to work. We could go gf5, which maybe I should consider a bit more. I think I thought that it just weakens our king too much after a move like pawn g4. But if pawn g4, we can just play take, take, and take. So I think we should actually be taking with the g-pawn. If here and pawn f4, trying to open up lines against my knight. So gf5, pawn f4. Knight f4, knight f4, ef4, bishop f4. It's interesting again. I think we should take with the pawn. And I think our king is fine. I mean, we always have the h8 square. And, you know, if White plays a move like queen d2 looking for bishop h6, then of course we meet that with pawn to f4. Forcing the bishop back to, like, f2. And then we can go, like, bishop f5. g4 can be met with en passant. And we should be absolutely fine. I suppose also, bear in mind, queen h4 check is still a threat, simply forking the king and the c4 pawn, which is why my opponent has gone pawn h4. Because now the rook defends the g4 square, and he's preparing bishop to g5. Now, one move stands out to me very immediately, which to me looks like the best move by a country mile, and it's pawn to f4. Simply disconnecting the bishop from g5. I'm obviously doing it with tempo. Bishop f5 is on the way. And we're taking away the g3 square, which white no longer controls with the h-pawn. So after something like f4 and bishop back to f2, if white ever tries to go g4 and we take en passant, then f3 is going to be stupid weak. So that looks very interesting. This is such a typical King's Indian. By the way, if you're enjoying the video so far, please drop a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I'd really appreciate it. If f4, bishop f2, I suppose the question is, what do we actually want to do next? What do we actually want? Bishop f5, I suppose. Let's say bishop to d... Sorry, there's no bishop to d3. Where does this knight go? I guess he can put a knight on e4. Although maybe then I can play take and pawn f3, which looks very powerful. Yeah, I think f4 is the way to go. I think f4. And we've constructed this very nice pawn chain in the center of the board, staring towards the white king. Now, there's a very high likelihood the white king will try to castle queenside, or just stay in the center. But I don't think the white king is safe, like, no matter where it goes, really. And I think our king is pretty safe on h8. I also like the move pawn f4 because, as I said, I was slightly concerned about my opponent going pawn f4 with ideas hitting my knight. But now we go f4, the f3 pawn can't move, which means my knight is nice and safe on the h5 square. I suppose my opponent is probably considering whether to put the bishop on f2 or d2. To me, the bishop should be going on f2. Because one of the main plans for white in these positions is to try to go pawn c5. But no, my opponent was not considering that whatsoever. Pawn g4. What a move. Okay, so he's hitting my knight. So I'm attacking his bishop. He's attacking my knight. If I take his bishop, he takes my knight. I take on f3. And it's interesting. I have a pawn on e3. It could be difficult to defend. He has the open g file. Okay, that's one option. The option that I'm more so leaning towards is taking en passant, because f3 is under attack and we keep the g file closed. If pawn f4, then we just take. And he could try tactics on my knight, I guess. But we also open up our bishop, which is nice. And the e-file is going to be a massive problem for white. So I think we should take en passant. If we take and he goes bishop to g5, hitting my queen, I think queen e8. I think? I don't know, this is interesting, actually. Maybe I should be taking the bishop. Maybe I should be taking the bishop. Take. I don't have to play rook f3, but it feels like the right move. Let's say rook f3, rook g1. Well, then we have queen h4. That's going to be pretty devastating. So I don't really have to worry about the g-file, do I? So I think I should take the bishop. And that is white's best attacking piece, actually, the dark squared bishop. Which means that my dark squared bishop is uncontested as well, which is a very big bonus. So, okay, we can go and nab a pawn. If bishop g2, rook f2, looks very strong. I don't see a reason not to take this pawn. If my opponent moves the knight to have a discovery on my rook, either bishop g4 defending, or I can just move the rook to f2 or to f4 doesn't really matter. I have lots of options there. I mean, I could even consider an exchange sacrifice. That wouldn't be ridiculous. But yeah, hopefully this is kind of demonstrating one of the main ideas of the King's Indian and why it's so interesting, particularly against this type of structure. Like, this is the structure of the King's Indian normally. And normally white is looking to play pawn to c5 and do something like take and attack me on the queen side. That's normally how white goes about this position or these structures. But I think particularly below 1800, not many people are going to understand that concept. I refer you to yesterday's upload, actually, where I was talking about the Caro-Kann minority attack, which is a very important concept in the Caro, but it's actually quite difficult to understand, particularly at lower ELOs. So a position could be good for black, for example, but only if they understand the concept of the minority attack. In this same way, I think the c5 pawn break is a slightly more advanced concept because it's all about pawn structure, and like positional play with pawn structure, which again, I think people below 1800 do struggle with, even above 1800 sometimes, I think. So hopefully, again, yesterday's video will be really interesting, particularly if you do play the Caro-Kann. But anyway, we are up a pawn. The white king is completely exposed. The center, he's completely exposed. The king side, he can never go to. And the queen side, we have open lines against on this diagonal. We have like the pawn coming to e4 to open up the dark squared bishop. He can never contest my dark squared bishop. He can't play rook g1 looking to counterattack because h4 will hang. And white is going to lose material after the knight blocks on g3, because our pawn is covering the king's escape routes. And this is looking very, very scary for white. White can't even play a move like queen d3 trying to castle queenside because we have bishop to f5 hitting the queen. And the queen would literally have to retreat back to d1. The queen could come out to b3, I suppose. That wouldn't be ridiculous, trying to just castle queenside quickly. I think we probably go knight to a6 in that scenario. And after castles, we can go knight to c5. But yeah, queen to d3. But I think just bishop to f5. If bishop f5 and knight to e4, I think white's getting tangled. Let's go bishop f5, hitting the queen. Knight e4 seems to be the only logical move to try to block things up in the center and castle. Maybe bring this knight to c3 to support the other knight. Problem is, I think we just have knight coming to b4 or c5. We could put it on d7, but I think it's stronger on a6. Yeah, we also have c6 trying to open up our queen. This is getting rather hopeless for white, I think. And I mean, to be fair, my opponent didn't really have a choice other than going knight to e4, because if he moves the queen, he has to go back to d1, and then he still can't castle queenside. That has to be the plan, and I think it's what he's going for. The whole idea of white going for this g4 move, I think, is completely wrong. Once white's got himself into this situation, I think he's just got to accept that we have accomplished one of the big goals of our opening and just try to castle queenside and form some kind of kingside or central attack with c5. I think c5 should still be the plan for white in this position, but it's very, very difficult. Okay, rook g1. Now, why did we say that rook g1 can't be played? Why did we say rook g1 can't be played? Queen h4. We've already established this. Queen h4. And pawn h6 is not a problem anymore because we cover that. Yeah? We've already established this, so we need to make sure we keep it in mind, right? So, you know, when we're looking at this position, we always are not concerned about the rook moving. We're not concerned about the g-file because h4 will always hang. I know we can go for these moves, knight to b4 or knight to c5, which will be devastating, but we might as well throw this in. Now here, we could trade if we really wanted to, and we would be up 2 pawns. So take, take, and knight takes. We could even go rook g3, which is tempting. It is tempting, because after rook takes, bishop takes, there is a... oh, no, there's no rook to g7 because of the pin. So if take with check, king moves, we're winning. The thing is, though, I don't want to play that. I think I'd rather go knight to c5. And my reasoning is because this knight can't move. This knight can't move. Why are we complicating things? Like, quite simply, white can't move. We might as well just add another attacker. That, to me, seems like the most simple option, to be honest. We could have even considered a move like rook a2 f8, looking to play something like take and rook takes f1, because we'd be doubled up. That would also be completely viable. We don't need to be playing a move like king h8 to get off of the g file, because h6 isn't going to happen anyway, and also this knight can't move because it's pinned to the king, so the rook can't open up for the time being regardless, and the white king doesn't have time to castle because we're threatening the queen. I'm trying to pile on insurmountable amounts of pressure to the white position. Now, if in this position you wanted to play something like bishop e4, or sorry, rook g3 and just trade a little bit, like something like, I don't know, rook g3, even queen e4, something like that, and just take your two pieces for a rook, and you've got a couple pawns with that, that would be fine. But, you know, maybe h6 is then an issue if the queens come off the board, because our queen no longer defends h6, the rook opens up on the g file. There's no need. The knights can't move. The knights can't move, and the rook and the queen need to defend the knights, which basically means all four of these pieces are paralyzed. They're paralyzed, and they're white's only developed pieces. So, you know, we don't really need to change the status quo. We might as well get even more material for our troubles. Okay, queen e2, hitting the rook. How do we deal with that? Well, I think we just go and take on e4, and our rook is defended. So it seems relatively simple. Bishop e4. The bishop defends the rook, the queen defends the bishop, the rook defends e3, and our queen is absolutely safe. Knight d3 is a threat. So, for example, if white castles here, which is crazy that he can castle, but he can, the king doesn't move through any checks, then we can go knight to d3 check, and the king will be forced to b1 or c2. And what does that mean? Oh, sorry, no, the rook defends d3. My bad. So I suppose if castles, probably rook f2, because we do need to be aware if castles, the knight now does threaten our bishop because it's no longer pinned. We have to be aware of that. So if castles queenside, I think rook f2 is the way to go. There's no time to take our bishop. I know it is defended by the queen, but, you know, and the knight. So it's actually not a big deal. But there's no time, because after rook f2 and queen e3, which is the queen's only safe square. So here we have rook c2 check, I think. And after king to b1, we have discoveries. So that should be game over. Is there anything else? I don't know, maybe. But do we need anything else? In fact, why don't we just take the knight? Yeah. That's actually way easier. That's way easier. You know, moves like rook to f2, they're going to be completely winning, sure. But there's no need for us to allow any complication if we can simply be up. I mean, what are we up? Like 2 pieces and 2 pawns in this position? Like, come on, that's better than creating any sort of complication. We're getting rid of white's most active piece, and forcing this rook to trade itself off as well. We have so many threats in this position, such as bishop to f3. We can bring our rook to f8 and f2. I don't know, the list probably goes on, but I don't really need to know every single threat in the position. The fact is that white can't move. White can't move. His king doesn't have any squares. He's down 2 pieces, down 2 pawns, and my opponent resigns. That was basically a perfect King's Indian, I think. So let's jump into the analysis and see what the engine has to say. I don't think I've ever had an accuracy this high. We played 19 moves, and I was out of theory very quickly. 99.6% accuracy? Excuse me? What? Sorry, let me show you. Okay, I know this setup looks really goofy, but look at that game review. Literally nothing wrong. Everything was perfect. That I know it was only 19 moves, but that's pretty nuts. That let's jump into the analysis. Let's go. Okay, all right. So my opponent opens with e4. We go pawn to d6. Like I said, if we go knight to f6, then e5, and this is no longer a King's Indian. This is an Alekhine? I don't know. Someone will tell me I'm wrong for sure. But anyway, it's his defense. The French Donny. Anyway, pawn d6 to stop that. Pawn d4, knight f6. As I said, e5 is a terrible move. So after take, and knight g4, double attack on f2 and e5. Game over, basically. King e1, knight e5. We're up a pawn, and white can't castle. Easy. Anyway, my opponent goes pawn f3, which, like I said, is called the lion's jaw variation, which is sick. We go pawn g6, pawn c4, bishop g7. Here the engine kind of thinks c5 is playable, because if this is taken, we have queen a5 check. And so, like, knight c3, queen c5, I guess we just have a better structure, because after bishop g7, we have a lovely diagonal, but... Alright, bishop g7, knight c3, castles, bishop e3, and pawn e5 is actually... It's a move, but the engine prefers pawn c5. And if this is taken... Whoa, dc5. Okay, queen d8, rook d8, bishop c5. I don't know if I understand this. Okay. So, I suppose there's no bishop d3. There's no knight f3. So let's say knight g2, b6. Okay. So if bishop e3, we have knight b4. And c2. Oh, and d3. Okay, got you. So let's say bishop a3, stopping that. Bishop e7. Okay. Let's say knight... Sorry, not that. Let's say knight d5, shutting down the d file. e6. Knight e7 check, knight e7, bishop e7, rook c8. Okay. Let's say knight g3. Okay, h5 looking to go h4. This is really weird. This is a really weird system. We're down a pawn, but I suppose we have so much activity. And this f3 move is really annoying for white because he can't develop properly. Anyway, I go e5, which is, I would say, more in the spirit of the King's Indian. And after d5, knight h5 is actually the best move. Now, the engine always thinks that white has an edge here. Again, c5 at some point should be the plan. I thought he'd probably go something like queen d2, looking for bishop to h6. And after something like f5, I didn't think bishop h6 was that good in this position. Does queen h4 check, apparently? Oh, yeah, okay, that makes sense. If this is taken, then again we go gf5. And if white castles queenside, for example, game continues with something like knight d7. If bishop to h6, we can go knight c5, but also queen f6, and we're fine here, really. Although it looks scary, our king is pretty safe on h8. But my opponent goes knight g to e2. We go pawn f5. He goes ef5, and we have to take back with the g-pawn. As I said, I considered rook takes with the idea of meeting g4 with rook f3, which is completely winning. But white doesn't have to go g4. Our rook is completely misplaced, and after a move like queen d2, we have to retreat the rook. And after castles, we're so far behind in development, it's not really funny at all. So gf5 has to be played. Here h4 is a mistake. Now I understand it, because I was half considering the move queen h4 check in this position. But I figured after bishop f2, queen c4, and something like fg6, hg6, and the knight moves with tempo on my queen, so let's say knight g3, hitting my queen, I wasn't very happy with this sort of position. So gf5, and we are preparing this check. So let's say white plays, I don't know, queen d2, then queen h4 check, bishop f2, and I thought this was an interesting option. The engine isn't convinced because of knight d4. Oh, is my queen trapped? It is. Yeah, my queen is trapped. That's an awesome move, by the way. So, okay. That wouldn't have been a good idea. But my opponent goes h4. And we continue with pawn to f4, kicking the bishop. But g4 is played. As I said, I thought my opponent was deciding between these two moves, and I'm correct in saying that bishop f2 has to be the move. Reason being, the bishop on f2 supports the c5 push. To me, that's the reason, and also defends the g3 square, which could be annoying, and defends the h4 pawn, which is weak. So to me, this is the logical move. Now, bishop d2 makes no sense, because the bishop can't see anything. Quite simply. And also, how is the white queen going to develop to castle queenside? Because if queen c2, then bishop f5, and if knight to e4, again, we probably have ideas of knight c5. If this knight moves, then we have knight to g3. Chaos erupts in the white position. So pawn g4 is interesting, and I was basically trying to decide between fe3 or fg3, and it wasn't that simple a decision, I don't think. But I think ultimately, while I quite like the look of f takes g3, after something like bishop g2, for example, defending the f3 pawn, then a move like knight f4 is very, very strong. And if, this is taken and ef4 and bishop d4 or something like this, I definitely would have gone for, I don't know, maybe I would have gone for this line if this was the case. But the problem after I take is that white has this nice bishop g5 move. And I was going to go queen e8, which is the best move. And if I can open up the e-file, I maybe would have gone for it. Except there's this knight to e4 move, just blocking the e-file up. And after something like rook takes f3, knight moves with tempo on the rook. The engine wants me to sack the rook for the knight. I probably wouldn't have done that. Probably rook f8, the queen defends the knight. And this is okay, but it doesn't feel like enough. Therefore, fe3. After gh5, rook f3, I realize it's actually really hard for white to move. It's unclear. If a move like bishop g2, engine suggests bishop h3. That's an awesome move. That's so cool. Point is, if you take the rook, then queen h4 check, the knight has to block, because as we already said, these squares are covered, and the bishop covers f1. So knight g3, queen g3, king e2, queen f2, king d3, bishop f5, knight e4, and the knight's coming into c5 like in the game. Which is nuts. And if the, I don't know, rook h3, bishop h3, queen h4, knight g3, queen g3, king moves, and we take on h3, and we're up, what, a piece and a couple pawns. That's completely winning. However, after bishop to g2, I thought that rook f2 was the easiest move. Quite simply. And after bishop e4, for example, we can just continue. Engine likes bishop h6. I think something like knight d7 into c5 or knight h6 into c5 makes a lot of sense. And I think this is just a very comfortable position. But I think this was probably a better way for white to try to go about the position. Queen d3, though, just allows bishop f5 with tempo. I thought queen b3 might be tried. But again, there is still knight to a6 coming in with tempo. And if castle queenside, knight c5, queen a3, bishop f5, this is completely devastating. The white king is going to get absolutely mauled. And if this pawn is ever taken by white, then my other bishop comes in and the game is just over. So queen d3, bishop f5. As I said, the only other safe square is d1, and then you can't castle, so knight e4 has to be played, and then knight to a6. How do you stop knight c5? The engine actually likes to move b4, giving up the b pawn to stop knight c5, and after queen back to b1, bishop takes, queen f6. I mean, are you really going to castle into this? I mean, it is the best move, but are you really going to do that? This is just completely lost. Down 2 pawns. I've got a passed e-pawn. Your pawn structure sucks, and your king is completely wide open. So my opponent went rook g1. But as I already discussed, that hangs the h4 pawn. I thought he was going to go knight to c3, trying to guard his knight. And after something like knight to c5, let's say queen c2, there's rook f2 there. So the best move is queen e2. And if rook here then takes, engine knights rook takes f1, followed by bishop takes e4, because the rook is under attack. So something like take, and, well, that allows takes. So queen takes, and then bishop e4, knight e4, and we have 2 pieces and a pawn for a rook, which is very, very nice. And this passed pawn on e3, and white structure sucks. And if white castles, then there's knight g3. So, but also we can look for a queen trade. But anyway, rook g1 from my opponent. We take on h4 with check, knight 2 to g3. And as I said, we could consider a move like rook g3. The engine suggests knight g3, but obviously that hangs the queen, so rook g3 is the only real option. And here, we could even go bishop takes here. And if queen takes, then we can take the queen. Sorry, that would be very silly. I don't know why I said that. And if something like queen e3, then what? We are up. We have 2 pieces for a rook, and we have a pawn on top of that. But again, you know, maybe white can actually try to use the g-file to cause some problems alongside moves like h6. So I didn't like that idea. I didn't like that idea. So instead, although that is deemed a brilliant move, knight c5 is just better. It's just better. After queen back to e2, we take on e4, castle queenside, and here just simply rook g3. I was considering moves like rook f2. And after queen e3, rook c2, king b1, rook c3. So queen e4, knight e4, and something like queen here. I don't know, king here, king h8. It's all winning. But, you know, it's far easier just to take the piece. And after rook takes, queen takes, white is down so much material, and they just can't move anywhere. There are no moves. So that was just the easiest option. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope all of my moves made sense from my explanations and the logic behind them. If you want to learn more about the King's Indian defense, then check out this video up here. And if you want to see the previous episodes of the playlist of the King's Indian versus everything, check out the playlist down there. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in one of those videos.